Hi, friends. Welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. And a Happy New Year to you if you're listening to this pretty near the live time it was recorded. As I record today's episode, I'm just crossing into a new year. And if it's not near New Year for you, then a Happy New Day to you. You're very welcome as we join together on our journey through the entire Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. And we're continuing our journey today through the Gospel of Luke. And the question I'm going to ask today is, how can we impress Jesus? So you're very welcome whether you're here for the very first time or you've been here from the very beginning. If you're watching on video, then there's the option, if you want just to listen to the audio, not to get distracted by this. and But but also it's actually, I find statistically people are much more engaged and much more likely to listen to the entire thing when accessing it through the audio on buzzsprout.com. You're not then tied to the screen, and and you're able to really focus on what's being said and the Word of God. And if you're listening to it online, please know that there is the video version of it as well now appearing on YouTube. Started doing that about 3 weeks ago. But either way, either format, you're very welcome. And if you are new to this, please hang on at the end where I'll tell you lots of ways you can connect to this ministry and get some other free Bible teaching resources around this passage today, and in fact for every episode I do. So with that said, we'll drop in and pick up in the text where we left off last time. Today we're doing the first 10 verses of Luke, and I'll see you at the end just to say bye-bye. So bye-bye for the moment. Hi friends, welcome back. I wonder if you've ever tried to impress somebody. I suppose all of us to some point we have times in our lives where we feel it's important to make a good impression. I know when we're young, well, young men particularly want to impress young women, don't they? I know I did, in the hope perhaps of maybe a date or just spending some time with them. And it seems to me that young girls want to do exactly the same thing for the same reason when it comes to their building of relationships and friendships. And of course, a potential employee, well, if you're going for a job interview, you kind of want to impress the employer, don't you? Or certainly the interviewer who's interviewing for the position. So the question becomes then, what should we do in order to impress somebody? Now, the difference between being an ordinary person and being a spiritual person, a believer, a Christian, that involves in some way being sure that what we do in the eyes of the Lord is correct. In a sense, what we do impresses upon Him that we are living the life of faith. And for that, we have a helpful passage, which I'm going to read for you, first of all, in its entirety. And in my Bible, it's called The Faith of the Centurion. Then we'll come back at it section by section and try and unpack it for you. But let me just begin by reading to you the first 10 verses of Luke chapter 7, which tells us this. When Jesus had finished saying all this to the people who were listening, he entered Capernaum. There a centurion's servant, whom his master valued highly, was sick and about to die. The centurion heard of Jesus and sent some elders of the Jews to him, asking him to come and heal his servant. But when they came to Jesus, they pleaded earnestly with him, "This man deserves to have you do this for him, because he loves our nation and has built our synagogue." So Jesus went with them. He was not far from the house when the centurion sent a friend to say to him, "Look, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. That is why I do not consider myself worthy to come to you. But say the word, and I know my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. And I say to the servant, do this, and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him, and turning to the crowd, following him, he said, "I tell you, I have not found such great faith even in Israel." Then the man, who had been sent returned to the house and found the servant well. Okay, this is a rather straightforward story, but some of the details are particularly interesting. So let's start at the beginning and walk through the story. So looking at the first 6 verses, 6.5 verses maybe, which should appear for you up on the screen if you're watching the video. In verse 1, we note it says, when Jesus had finished talking to the people. Now, that's a reference to what's just gone, the closing latter part of the previous chapter, where we have just been together through Luke's version of what is often called the Sermon on the Mount. And in this case, it's telling us, well, he's just finished doing that teaching, and now he enters Capernaum. Perhaps you've heard me say this before, but it's also worth noting this. Jesus, as we know, was born in Bethlehem, but he was said to be from the region of Nazareth. However, once he started his ministry, he was pretty much driven out of Nazareth, and he ended up in Capernaum, and it was Capernaum which sort of became his headquarters, if you like. Now, if you trace the life and ministry of Christ after that, you'll discover that he repeatedly exits and re-enters Capernaum several times. So in many ways, it could, in a sense, be called his headquarters. Also, Peter lived there, and perhaps that's why he made it his base, in a sense. At any rate, we see here, for one of the first times, him re-entering the region of Capernaum. Verse 2 then tells us that a centurion's servant, one who was dear to the centurion, was sick almost to the point of death, and that he, that is the centurion, had heard about Jesus, so he sends the local elders of the local Jewish leadership, he sends them to Jesus asking them to plead on his behalf to come and heal, not him, but his servant. Now, just at this point, I'd like to pause for a moment and do a quick character sketch of this guy, this centurion. There's lots of little details here in the story which help us paint an interesting picture of what this guy was really like. And I'll point out to them as we go through it. For example, it tells us when Jesus heard these things, he marveled and turned to the crowd saying, I have not found such faith even in Israel. That's at the conclusion of the passage. And for that reason, we know that this centurion was a Roman. He was definitely a Gentile. So that's the first characteristic we need to draw attention to. He was a centurion, a Roman centurion, and he wasn't one of the very few rare Jewish people who held that role, perhaps as few as 3, I read in one account, but that this guy is definitely a dyed-in-the-wool Roman Gentile, if you like, centurion. And there's a significance to that. The fact is that the Jews, as a group, tended to despise the people they referred to as Gentiles, and the Gentiles also had a great distrust for the Jews. Anti-Semitism is not a new thing, friends. It dates all the way back to here and even further. The Romans actually called the Jews and referred to them as a filthy race. They spoke of Judaism as a barbaric superstition, and they actually believed that the Jews not only set themselves apart from mankind, but they interpreted that as to think that the Jews actually hated other people, which isn't in fact the case. Also, some Gentiles had become weary of the many gods and loose morals of the pagan Roman world in which they lived. So there was the beginnings of the appearance of some conversions taking place of pagans and Romans converting to Judaism. So that's the whole atmosphere that lies behind the story. But here we see something different going on. There's an unusual close friend between a centurion and, very importantly, the local Jewish leadership. So this guy is definitely a Gentile, but yet he's described unusually as being a close friend of the local Jews. And that's an important thing we need to note. So he's a centurion, and he's a Gentile, important, and he's in favor. He's favorable towards the local Jews. All this is important. The second really major importantly thing is the very simple fact that he is a centurion. The text openly tells us that, and so the so it's interesting to just take a moment and consider what it meant when it describes him as a centurion. To understand that, a little bit about the Roman army in our background will help. The Roman army, as you may know, was divided into legions, and that was divided into cohorts. The legions at the time of Christ consisted of about 6,000 men, not the thousand that some people believe. And the legion was divided into cohorts, which intended to be closer to 1,000, which in turn were divided into groups of around 100 men. And it was a centurion that commanded each of these groups of 100 men. So to say that he was a centurion meant in military terms that he had 100 men under his authority. Historians of that time absolutely described centurions as the cement which held the Roman army together. They were the backbone. They were actually considered not only the finest soldiers, but the finest men in the Roman army. Because, of course, some of the higher ranking people were not there based on merit. So here we have a Gentile man, a Roman, a military man, someone with respect and authority in charge of 100 men who has reached that position on merit, hence his title, Centurion, from where we get the modern term century. So the third thing we can say about him on top of those two facts is all of this points to the important thing that this is a man of ability, but also of character. It was always expected that the men of fortitude and men who showed good character would be the people who rise to hold the job of centurion. Interestingly, as an aside, all of the examples, there's only a few of them, of centurions, when mentioned in the New Testament, are always men who are seen to have a degree of insight and moral character. One author I read said that in terms of qualifications of a Roman soldier rising to the role of centurion, he must not be a seeker of danger, as the men of his command must simply know that he's ready and steady in the face of danger or action, and he must remain reliable throughout. And that importantly, they must not be over anxious to rush into a fight, but when necessarily, absolutely be able and willing and ready to stand and hold the ground. So this is the type of guy we're talking about here. An intelligent man, respected by others, a man of character. And he's obviously to some degree either wealthy or has control of great financial resources, because in verse 5 it tells us, "For he loves our nation and he built our synagogues." That's what our synagogue, that's what the locals are saying about him. So of all the things you could say about him, you have to add to the fact, also saturated throughout this passage, is the fact that it's flagging up. Even with all these abilities, he's also a man of compassion. In fact, that's the whole point of these verses. For it tells us, first of all, that he is a servant, and that servant was dear to him, and that servant was sick and was ready to die. And obviously this centurion has compassion on that servant. And because of that, the centurion, he sends these local Jewish guys to come to tell Jesus to ask him to come and heal his servant. So this obviously is flagging up that this guy has empathy and compassion for those he has authority over. Now, it's also important to note that this is a slave it's talking about, and it's this slave who's described as dear to him. That's the person who's sick, and he's willing to take these, well, simply extraordinary steps to try and help. One commentator I read says in Roman law, a slave was defined as a living tool, someone who had no rights. A master could treat and deal with him in any way he wanted, even kill him without facing consequences if he so chose. Normally, when a slave was past the point of being able to work or uselessness or being useful, he was simply discarded, thrown out to die. So this indicates something very different here, doesn't it? This is a man of compassion. And I think the other important thing to note about him is there's a sense of humility here. As a matter of fact, we pick that up from the fact that he knew and respected the Jewish customs about they were forbidden to enter the house of a Gentile. So when he'd summoned the Lord and knew he was coming to him, he actually sent another message to say, you know, you don't actually have to come into my house. So there's a whole lot of things in this passage to say that he's a man of humility and a man who respects the Jewish faith. So the very least we can say about him is that he was pious, but maybe even more because it notes that he also helped build the synagogue. Now, some have concluded that that meant he might be someone who's a convert to Judaism, but most don't think that that's necessary to take that perspective, because he could have built the synagogue just for political reasons or for the sake of the peace of the region that he was working in. But given everything in this passage, I think we can reasonably say that at the very least he was a Gentile, God-fearing man, possibly a proselyte, but in the very least we can say he was a pious man who was well disposed to the Jewish faith and the people of the Jewish faith. So he sends someone to the Lord to hear his requirements, and we're told in these verses that it's actually the local leadership, the local eldership of the Jews, and he tells them to go on his behalf and plead with him to come and heal his servant. Now, also, let's just frame this story in its political context. He was a Roman. He has authority over a part of the city, or the town in which he lived, and there he's built a synagogue. So think about it from the Jewish elders' point of view. This is someone who has real influence on them. And this is the same guy who's heard that there's this Jewish rabbi out there teaching and healing people. And he decides, well, what I will do is I'll get the local religious leadership from the same background to go and invite him to come and help me here. So it is these guys, the local leadership, the eldership, that come to Jesus and they request that he does exactly that. And they also adds that they say that this guy who sent them, the centurion, is someone who deserves his attention. Now, I need to underline that point. That's interesting because of what comes up next. Because they say he deserves our attention and they offer two reasons why he deserves our attention. First, they point out that he loves our nation. I've already talked about that. But they're also saying, look, you ought to help this guy because he loves Jewish people. So let's go together and you come with us and help this Gentile who's been good to us and appears to love us as a people. And then also they add in the fact also that he's built the synagogue. So they're saying he not only loves us, but be aware that he's put his money where his mouth is. So it's reasonable for us to help him back. Maybe it's nothing more than this guy's got money and position, so let's return the favor. So that's the request. Now we're going to get to the reaction. So let's look together at verse 6. Picking up halfway through verse 6, he was not far from the house when the centurion sent friends to say to him, Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. This is why I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you. But say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes, and I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. Okay, that's interesting. We have in verse 4 the elder saying this guy's deserving of our attention. And now we have in verse 6 the guy's own opinion of himself disclosed. And he says, I'm not worthy of this. I'm not worthy for you to even enter into my house under my roof. Now, I think that shows that he was aware of the Jewish custom, the requirement that they didn't eat with Gentiles. Just tuck that one away for a moment. So he's at the very least respecting Jewish customs. But the point is, in all of these actions, it's showing a great sense of humility, isn't it? He's talking about not being worthy. He's talking about that he's not worthy to come into his house and have dinner. And he actually underpins it by saying, no, you just need to say the word, and I know my servant will be healed. Now look carefully at verse 8. He could have said, hey, look, I'm a centurion. I'm an important guy. I tell people what to do and they do it. I've great authority. I say just do it and they do it. But that's not what he says. He says, I am a man placed under authority. So he recognizes that there's an authority level here, a tier of authority, and that so again, it's underscoring again and again the fact that this is a guy who's a humble man, as knows his place in the great scheme of things. I think it's also kind of interesting that other people come and say they're the ones who say the good things about him. They're the ones who say he's deserving. They're the ones who say he built the synagogue. They're the ones who declare him worthy. But when it comes to what he says about himself, he says, I'm not worthy, to the point of saying Jesus isn't even able to come into my house. Let's see Jesus' response in verse 9. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him, and turning to the crowd followed him. He said, And turning to the crowd following him, he said, I tell you, I have not found such great faith even in Israel. Then the man who had been sent returned to the house and found the servant well. Now in verse 9 it talked about him marveling at this situation. I wonder what that means. Well, I want you to notice that he marveled at two things. He marveled at the unbelief of the people in Israel. He said, I have not found such faith in Israel. But he also marvels at the faith of the man himself. The fact that this Gentile has such an sincere and in-depth faith in him, to the point that he's not seen the like of it in Israel. And he noticed it tells us that they return, and it says that they found the man well. It doesn't actually say healed. It says more than that, he was well. Some have suggested that this meant he not only healed him of the particular ailment that was troubling him, that overall he restored him to full good health in all areas. Okay, so that's the story. And my question then is, what's the point of the story? Jesus here is obviously impressed with this Gentile, isn't he? So what is it he's impressed about? What can we learn from him about the sort of thing that impresses, to use that word, Jesus? Well, very simply, Jesus was impressed, first of all, in his faith. I have not found such great faith, he says. I said at the very beginning that this is a relatively straightforward story, and the simple point of the story is the fact that Jesus, the thing that impresses him here, was the Gentiles' faith on one hand and the Jewish unbelief, the lack of faith, on the other. Now, the reason I want to put this in context is remember that this centurion was a man of, we might say, commendable qualities. I've mentioned the fact that he's a man of character, integrity, fortitude, a man of compassion. He's humble, he's pious. All of those qualities, all are commendable. But the two that impresses him, and the one on this man, which over and all impresses Jesus about this man, is the quality of his faith. You see, Roman soldiers were actually trained to be totally self-sufficient. So here is a man who has the characteristics to be wholly self-sufficient, yet is willing to place his trust and have faith in Jesus Christ. Now, I think I could have made a case up to the last couple of verses by saying the main focus on this passage was the humility of this man, the fact that he talks about being not worthy, the fact that he's a man of position, yet he's still got great humility. But I would think when you read the conclusion of it in the last two verses, you have to say the main point, the main thing that is actively declared to impress Jesus is the fact that he has faith, but combined with humility. And I have to say that one is absolutely connected to the other. You see, if you're proud, you're really not going to trust the Lord, are you? When you don't believe you have a problem, then you're not going to ask God to help with that problem. What we all need, to a certain degree, friends, is a really healthy dose of humility. One where we're able to recognize, see, understand, and say, you know what, Lord, I know I'm not worthy, but I believe in you, and I believe you can do this for me or can help me in the ways I can't help myself. It's in a desperate situation. Well, if you try and solve it for yourself, if you believe and think, right, this is awful, or there's something in terms of your character, and your focus is totally on, I can do this, I need to sort this out on my own, then that's the place where you're not really going to be calling on the Lord, isn't it? This man here in the story exists to show that he has all the earthly, worldly characteristics and advantages. He's a Roman soldier. However, the single thing that Jesus is impressed with is that someone who, even with all those traits and abilities, still says, you know what, I'm unworthy. And because of that, I need to trust you in this situation. The situation is beyond me, and I recognize that. So, what that tells me, if you want to trust the Lord, you need two things. Very simply, you need faith and you need humility. And looking at this chapter, boy, does this man have humility and faith. Jesus, in fact, says about his faith, I have not found such a great faith in all of Israel. So the question that this asks is, do you have humility, friends, and do you have faith? Do you have a little bit of faith, a mustard seed of faith? Do you have a faith that can be worked and grow into a great faith? Not great because of what it is we have, but because of the person, the object of our faith, the Lord Jesus Christ. Even those of us who have a modicum of faith, I think would have to be honest and look at it and say we could do with some more, right? Well, if you could do with a little more faith, let's turn for a moment and close by looking at Luke chapter 17, verse 5, because in that situation, the apostles came to the Lord Jesus and actually asked him to increase our faith. So if you want to increase the thing that most impresses the Lord Jesus, well, as your homework, that's what I'd like you to do tonight. I'd like you to be able to say, Lord, I recognize in humility that you need more faith, and ask the Lord to give you more faith. The important thing to understand when coming to this story is seeing that the centurion, the purpose of it, I believe, is to reveal the two indispensable requirements for receiving the blessings of God. That is a deep sense of humility before God and a wholehearted faith in his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. Today, this is still the same way that anybody receives a divine blessing, just like he did. We must realize our own inability, our own worthlessness, and at the same time cherish and nurture a steadfast faith in Jesus Christ. Let me close by just showing you a journey made by our own Apostle Paul and what he said about himself as he progressed in his story throughout his letters and accounts. In AD 57, he wrote this. He said, I am the least of the apostles and not worthy to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God. That's AD 57. And he considers himself, as he described himself, the least of all apostles. But a few years later, 4 years later, in AD 61, he writes this, to me, who am the less and the least of all the saints, this grace was given that I should preach among the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ. Okay, and then a year later again, he writes this in AD 72 in a letter saying, and unworthy of all acceptation that Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the chief. So he starts on his journey as considering himself to be the least of the apostle. He drops down to becoming the least of all saints, and then he drops further where he puts himself as the worst of all sinners. So it's important to recognize that your attitude towards yourself as you stand and come before a holy God is that one of humility. Many people sadly have inflated opinions of themselves. And sometimes indeed life will come along and that balloon for them. And in a sense, it's better that we all, in a healthy way, deflate our own sense of ego from time to time. We're the least of the saints, and we're the chief of sinners, as Paul put it. Paul was a man of great faith, yet he wrote about himself and his journey in this way. And at the end, when facing his own death, he wrote to his, almost like his son in the faith, Timothy, saying this: I have fought the good fight, I have finished the course, I have kept the faith that is laid up for me, and thereby there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me on that day. Of all the things you could say about the Apostle Paul, right at the top of his list and at the very end, he wants to express that he's a humble man, but yet he still remains a man of faith. And that, I believe, my friends, are the two main things that really impress the Lord. Okay, we'll leave it there for today. Thank you for joining me today, friends, and we'll pick up the story in chapter 7, verse 11 tomorrow, when we look at Jesus raising the child of a widow. So I do hope you found our time together helpful. Can I remind you, you've been listening to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. It's available on all the main podcast platforms, and you can subscribe to it there and continue to listen or watch it there and receive it. If you want to have access to all the main resources, the place to find active links is on the Bible Project at buzzsprout.com. If you're not seeing them in the description where you're currently getting your podcast from, I place links to places like the social networks, my LinkedIn page, and the YouTube channel, which over the fullness of time will become the main place for the audio archive because of its ability to put things into playlist format. So you'll be able to find your way and navigate your way to individual books of the Bible and even themes later as I introduce them, which will make the teaching more accessible. But the daily podcast still is hosted on Buzzsprout, and then from there is sent out to all the major podcast platforms every way. And by clicking on the subscribe, you have made the decision to make the in-depth study of the Bible part of the rhythm of your daily life. Not just the reading of the Word, but the study of it. You've also got access there to additional resources. Every day I put an extensive episode notes page. In fact, I also put a full transcript of pretty much everything I say in the transcript page on Buzzsprout. And all of these things I put there are freely available. They're free to you to take and use in whatever way you want. No copyright on anything. And it's also in that place you'll find links to not only Buzzsprout but to Patreon. And that's the place where people can connect and support this ministry, if you like, thereby enabling it to be free. I really couldn't do this without that support. This ministry costs thousands and thousands of dollars a year. And the ability to provide this teaching and make it freely available by the funding of those people who have decided to partner with it. So we can all be grateful for that. If you feel that that's something you're called to do, you can do it there. But I know for the vast majority of you, they're very happy that you just access and receive this teaching every day and use it to the benefit of your Christian walk. And hopefully other people around you can be impacted by it as well. You can do that by actually liking it or sharing it on social media so more people have an opportunity also to decide to study the Bible in this way. So having said all that, thanks to each and every one of you. Thank you to you today for being here with me. It's a real privilege and a pleasure to be able to do this at my time of life. So thanks again for being here, and I'll be back again tomorrow, or whatever day it is for you, as we work together through the entire Bible at the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Bye-bye for now.